Hi, my friends. Today I want to present you a new story. Enjoy watching it.
The clock struck midnight, and the house was shrouded in a heavy silence, broken only by the creaks of settling wood. Mr. Stanley, 73 years old, stirred in his bed. The nightly pressure in his bladder nudged him awake. Groggily, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cool wooden floor beneath his feet. "Careful, dear," his wife murmured, half asleep beside him. "Take it slow." Stanley nodded and rose to his feet. The room was dark, lit only by the dim glow of a street lamp outside. He shuffled toward the bathroom, moving slowly and deliberately. His heart pounded harder than usual, a reminder of his age. As he reached the bathroom, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He gripped the sink, trying to steady himself. "Not now," he whispered, but his body had other plans. His vision blurred, and his legs wobbled. "Stanley, are you okay?" His wife's voice called from the bedroom. "I'm fine, just a bit lightheaded," he replied, though his voice was strained. But he wasn't fine. A sharp pain shot through his chest, and he collapsed to the floor with a heavy thud. His wife, alarmed by the noise, rushed to his side. "Stanley. Oh my God, Stanley," she cried, grabbing the phone on the bedside table. Her hands trembled as she dialed 911. "Please hurry. My husband has collapsed," she pleaded. The paramedics arrived swiftly, their efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos in the house. They worked tirelessly, their faces grim. Despite their best efforts, the reality was clear. At the hospital, the doctor approached Mrs. Stanley. "I'm sorry, ma'am. He suffered a massive heart attack. We did everything we could." Mrs. Stanley's world shattered. The suddenness of her husband's death left her reeling. How could this happen?" she asked, her voice breaking. The doctor sighed. "It's not uncommon for elderly individuals to experience severe complications from sudden movements at night. Their bodies can't always handle abrupt changes in blood pressure and heart rate." Back home, the emptiness was palpable. Stanley's laughter and stories lingered like ghosts. That night had forever altered their lives, a stark reminder of the fragile line between life and death. The family gathered to mourn, resolving to spread awareness and prevent others from facing the same tragic fate. In the days following Mr. Stanley's sudden death, the family was consumed with grief and questions. Mrs. Stanley, now a widow, sat with Dr. Harrison in his office, seeking answers. Dr. Harrison leaned forward, a sympathetic look in his eyes. "There are several reasons why Mr. Stanley might have experienced such a sudden and severe reaction that night. We need to consider emotional fluctuations, dietary factors, and underlying diseases." Mrs. Stanley clutched her handbag tightly. "What do you mean by emotional fluctuations?" "Significant emotional stress before bed can affect sleep quality and cause nighttime wakening." "Did anything unusual happen before he went to sleep that night?" Mrs. Stanley thought for a moment. "He was worried about our grandson. They had an argument over the phone. Stanley was quite upset." Dr. Harrison nodded. "Emotional stress can cause the brain to remain alert, leading to frequent waking and potential complications." "But what about his diet?" she asked. "He didn't eat anything out of the ordinary." Even if he didn't eat anything unusual, consuming large amounts of food or liquids before bed can slow digestion and increase the burden on the body, Dr. Harrison explained. "Did he have any dietary habits that might have affected him?" Mrs. Stanley sighed. "He loved his late-night tea. He said it helped him relax." Dr. Harrison frowned slightly. "Tea can increase water intake, leading to frequent trips to the bathroom. It's also possible that he had underlying conditions like diabetes or prostate issues that made him more vulnerable." The mention of diabetes struck a chord with Mrs. Stanley. He was diagnosed with diabetes last year, but he managed it well with medication. "Even well-managed diabetes can cause complications," Dr. Harrison said gently. Blood sugar fluctuations can affect kidney function, leading to more frequent urination. Mrs. Stanley's eyes filled with tears. He was always so careful. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, the body's fragility takes over, Dr. Harrison said softly. It's crucial to move slowly at night, keep warm, and avoid cold water. These precautions can help mitigate sudden health risks. Mrs. Stanley nodded, absorbing the information. What can we do to prevent this from happening to others? Educating people about the risks and necessary precautions is a start, Dr. Harrison replied. Raising awareness can save lives. As Mrs. Stanley left the doctor's office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would honor Stanley's memory by spreading awareness about the causes and prevention of nighttime incidents. His death would not be in vain. As Mrs. Stanley began her campaign to raise awareness about the dangers of nighttime movements for the elderly, she encountered resistance from an unexpected source. During a community health seminar she organized, a man stood up at the back of the room, his presence commanding attention. Dr. Raymond Michaels, a prominent local physician known for his controversial views, had arrived. "Excuse me, Mrs. Stanley," Dr. Michaels began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you suggesting that we should frighten the elderly into immobility? This fear-mongering is hardly helpful." Mrs. Stanley stood her ground. "Dr. Michaels, my husband's sudden death was preventable. We need to educate people about the risks and the necessary precautions." Dr. Michaels smirked. "The elderly are already inundated with advice. Adding more will only cause unnecessary anxiety. What they need is reassurance, not more warnings." The room buzzed with murmurs as attendees whispered among themselves. Mrs. Stanley felt her resolve harden. "With all due respect, Dr. Michaels, knowledge and caution are not the same as fear-mongering. My husband's death was a wake-up call. Ignorance is far more dangerous." A woman in the audience raised her hand. "My father has diabetes and often wakes up at night. Should he be concerned?" Mrs. Stanley nodded. "Yes, he should be cautious. Moving slowly, staying warm, and avoiding cold water can make a significant difference." Dr. Michaels interjected, "Let's not overcomplicate things. Elderly individuals are resilient and capable. We should focus on empowering them, not coddling them." Mrs. Stanley took a deep breath, her voice steady. "Empowerment comes from being informed. Ignoring the risks won't make them disappear. We can and should do both, educate and support." The room fell silent as the tension between Mrs. Stanley and Dr. Michaels became palpable. Another man, seated near the front, stood up. "My mother fell and broke her hip getting up too quickly one night. If she had known about these precautions, she might have been spared the pain and the surgery." Dr. Michaels' face tightened, but he remained silent. The audience's support for Mrs. Stanley was growing. "Thank you for sharing," Mrs. Stanley said, turning back to the crowd. "This is why we're here, to learn from each other and prevent further tragedies." After the seminar, Dr. Michaels approached Mrs. Stanley. "You're playing a dangerous game. Fear spreads faster than facts." "I'm not spreading fear, Dr. Michaels," she replied firmly. "I'm spreading awareness. There's a difference." As he walked away, Mrs. Stanley knew she had made an enemy, but she also knew that the stakes were too high to back down. Her fight had just begun, and she was determined to protect others from the same fate that had befallen her husband. The community center was packed for Mrs. Stanley's next seminar. Determined to prevent more tragedies, she had gathered experts to share vital information. As the attendees settled, Mrs. Stanley stepped up to the podium, her heart pounding with purpose. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady. "Tonight, we will discuss practical steps to ensure our elderly loved ones are safe during nighttime awakenings." Dr. Harrison, the compassionate physician who had guided Mrs. Stanley after her husband's death, took the stage. "The first precaution is movement," he said. "Elderly individuals should move slowly and deliberately when getting up at night. Sudden movements can cause rapid blood pressure changes, leading to dizziness and falls." An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. But what if they feel an urgent need to use the bathroom? It's crucial to emphasize taking a moment to sit at the edge of the bed before standing, Dr. Harrison advised. This allows the body to adjust. Mrs. Stanley chimed in. Stanley often felt rushed. If only he had known to take his time. Next, Dr. Harrison moved on to keeping warm. Cold temperatures can shock the system. Keeping a robe or blanket handy can help maintain body temperature. A middle-aged man interjected, "My father always drinks cold water at night. Is that dangerous?" Dr. Harrison nodded. Yes, it can be. Cold water can cause gastrointestinal spasms and disrupt sleep. It's better to have room temperature water available. The room was silent, absorbing the information. Mrs. Stanley then introduced Dr. Patel, a dietitian. Eating habits before bed play a significant role in nighttime waking. Dr. Patel stepped forward. Avoid heavy meals and too much liquid before bed. Spicy and greasy foods can cause discomfort and frequent urination. A young woman in the back asked, "What about snacks? My grandmother loves her late-night cookies." "Light snacks are fine," Dr. Patel responded, "but avoid anything that can cause bloating or excessive thirst." Mrs. Stanley concluded the seminar. Developing healthy sleep habits is key. Going to bed and waking up at the same time each day can improve overall sleep quality. Dr. Harrison added, for those with conditions like diabetes or prostate issues, managing these conditions with the help of a healthcare provider is essential. Medications should be taken as prescribed, without adjustments unless advised by a doctor. As the seminar ended, an elderly gentleman approached Mrs. Stanley. "Thank you for this. I didn't realize how much these small changes could help." Mrs. Stanley smiled. "It's the little things that make a big difference. We must take care of our loved ones." Leaving the seminar, Mrs. Stanley felt a sense of fulfillment. She had armed her community with knowledge and tools to protect their elders, honoring Stanley's memory in the most meaningful way. The sun dipped below the horizon as Mrs. Stanley welcomed attendees to the final seminar in her series on elderly care. Tonight, the focus was on the overarching importance of sleep health, a topic close to her heart after Stanley's untimely death. "Good evening, everyone," Mrs. Stanley began, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "Tonight, we explore how vital sleep is to overall health, especially for the elderly." Dr. Harrison, a steadfast ally, took the stage. Sleep is not just a time of rest. It's a crucial period for the body to repair itself, regulate hormones, and maintain cognitive function. An elderly woman in the audience raised her hand. "Why do older people seem to sleep less?" "As we age, changes in the sleep cycle can make it harder to stay asleep," Dr. Harrison explained. "But inadequate sleep can lead to serious health issues like memory problems, a weakened immune system, and increased risk of chronic conditions." Mrs. Stanley stepped forward, her expression solemn. "Stanley often woke up at night, and we didn't realize how much it was affecting his health. He seemed fine, but the lack of restorative sleep took a toll on his body." Dr. Patel, the dietitian, joined them. "Good sleep hygiene can make a significant difference. Establishing a routine where you go to bed and wake up at the same time every day helps regulate your internal clock." A man in the middle row spoke up. "What about technology? My father is always on his phone before bed." Dr. Patel nodded. "Electronic devices emit blue light that can disrupt sleep. It's best to avoid screens at least an hour before bedtime. Instead, encourage reading a book or listening to calming music." Mrs. Stanley added, "We also found that creating a comfortable sleep environment is crucial. Stanley's room was often too warm. Keeping the bedroom cool and dark can promote better sleep." Dr. Harrison addressed the audience again. "Physical health directly impacts sleep. Regular exercise, even light activities like walking, can help improve sleep quality, but avoid strenuous activity close to bedtime." A woman near the back raised her hand. "My mother has sleep apnea. How does that affect her sleep?" Sleep apnea causes interruptions in breathing during sleep, leading to poor sleep quality and increased health risks. Dr. Harrison explained, "It's important to seek medical treatment for such conditions to ensure adequate and restorative sleep." Mrs. Stanley looked around the room, seeing nods of understanding and determination. "Remember, taking these steps doesn't just improve sleep, it enhances overall health and well-being." After the seminar, an elderly man approached Mrs. Stanley. "Your dedication to this cause is inspiring. How can we help spread this message?" "By sharing what you've learned here," she replied. "Talk to your families, friends, and neighbors. The more people understand the importance of sleep, the better we can protect our loved ones." As the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Stanley felt a sense of accomplishment. She had turned her grief into a mission, one that could save lives and improve the quality of life for countless others. In honoring Stanley's memory, she had found her purpose and made a lasting impact on her community.